I'm going to talk about drugs. All right. So, my biggest part of my harm reduction experience was through DanceSafe. DanceSafe does drug testing and some peer support and information sort of stuff for festivals that go around the country and do that. I've been volunteering with them for about 5 years. I'm at the point with it where I am not affiliated with any particular chapter, and I just float around to chapters that need help. And it means I can travel the country, going to festivals and helping people do their drugs better. I also have experience with psychedelic peer support. I am Zendo trained. I've done similar things like that. Slightly different focus than DanceSafe, but it's also part of the harm reduction world. I do consider myself a harm reductionist. I run free drug checking services for anyone in the community. And let's see here. This QR code leads to a link tree. It's not actually a link tree. It's a version of link tree that doesn't keep your data. We'll talk about confidentiality in a second. But that will help you contact me over Signal or Proton Mail if you need any services related to reducing harm related to drug use. So that includes like needles or cookers or fentanyl testing strips or Narcan or just information or reagent drug testing or literally anything that you might need. Yeah, okay. And in terms of what I mean by harm reduction, so harm reduction to me refers to programs, practices, and policies that aim to minimize negative effects associated with drug use, drug policies, and drug laws. So when I say harm reduction, I'm meaning specifically in terms of drugs. And also I want to mention that I am not a doctor or an expert in public health or anything like that. I'm just a harm reduction person. Okay, very quickly, why I talked about Signal and Proton Mail. I feel like it bears repeating, and it is a harm reduction thing. So you should all know that cell companies and email providers keep your messages indefinitely. There is no reason for them to give up that data. They keep it on the cell tower, they keep it in their servers. Those unencrypted messages can be read by third parties at any time, and companies consistently cooperate with law enforcement or other corporations to release that information. So if you need to have a conversation where you actually want to maintain your right to privacy, it needs to be over an end-to-end encrypted network. There's easy ways to do that. You can download an app called Signal, and then you use people's regular phone number and you can talk to them directly. That one provides end-to-end encryption and also allows you to have the messages disappear, like on Snapchat. Proton Mail is also a really solid one, and either of those can be used to contact me. Never talk to anyone about drugs on an unencrypted line, not your friends, not your doctor. If it's an illegal activity, you're endangering yourself and everyone in your community when you have those conversations. And it's not like you have to be being watched at that moment. They can just take interest in you and then pull your cell records for the last however many years they can get a warrant for. So that evidence exists permanently, like you've published. Think of it that way. When you text someone, you are publishing that information. Okay. So, disclaimer, NAPS does not encourage or endorse the use of any psychoactive substances for any reason. No drug use is ever 100% safe. The information that follows is intended solely for educational and harm reduction purposes. Please use your own research, do your own research and use your best judgment. I said that because we kind of need to, but also it is true that I am not omniscient and nothing is ever 100% safe, and following all these practices does not mean that nothing bad will ever happen to you. Okay. If there's a lot of information that's going to happen here, but I've tried to reduce it down to 3 basic principles that I really think if you can manage to follow will avoid almost the entirety of the adverse drug reactions people have. First one is test your drugs. The second one is proceed with caution, or start low, go slow. That's another way to put that one. And also to be prepared for an adverse event, even if you planned yourself well. Okay, so test your drugs. Why test your drugs? The short answer is because if substance intersected at any point with the black market, there is probably shit in it besides what you intended to obtain. When the manufacture of drugs is prohibited, it creates a black market in which no regulation of the product can exist. As a result, drugs obtained on the black market are often adulterated and or misidentified, leading to adverse outcomes for users. Drug users in a black market generally, and I think generally is not true always, do not know the contents of what they are consuming, and they are often relying on the word of their dealers to protect themselves. However, dealers too are generally unaware of the actual contents of their products, often relying on the word of their supplier, and so on and so on. Trusting the word of your dealer is not an effective strategy, no matter how good of a friend they are. You need to test your own drugs. Why do you need to test your own drugs? All right. First of all, let me just say it is genuinely not my intention to scare anyone or deter anyone from using drugs or endorse anyone to use drugs. I'm neutral on this fact. But the following not fun facts I think need to be known by everyone, really. The first one is that drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. That is higher than car accidents. That is higher than COVID-19. It is the highest drug death rate in the world. Period, per 100,000 people, adjusted for population. This is largely due to contamination, misrepresentation, and a lack of consumer knowledge in the black market. People don't know what they're taking and they don't know how much. And all of those things are a direct result of prohibition. Okay, high potency additives, for instance, fentanyl, xylazine, or clolazolam are showing up everywhere in Colorado. I'd say it's in about 90% of the heroin, 1% of the cocaine, and it's sporadically distributed amongst MDMA, ketamine, Xanax, methamphetamine, etc. I literally just pulled the first 4 articles that showed up when I Googled it. There's so many deaths that are happening in Boulder, like right here, right now. And this is just to try to communicate, like, it really is a problem, and people always have reasons to assume they're safe that aren't testing their drugs. And I just really would like to discourage people from having those thoughts. Okay, another thing people should know about, even as just a PSA, is that there's a rise in fake pharmaceuticals. Specifically, these are being made by the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, and they're being pressed in actual pharmaceutical labs. There is no way to tell the difference between these drugs and like the real stuff. All of the filler is the same chemical. The press they use is the exact same press. But instead of containing Xanax, or the blue pills are supposed to be oxys, they're actually just fentanyl and filler. In fact, actually, that specific Xanax bar, there was like a wave, I think it killed 9 CU Boulder students last year, was a series of fentanyl Xanax. And this is also just to point out, this I think is very clear at this point, that there is no point at which making drug use more dangerous will successfully deter people from using them. As we have clearly seen, it will only increase deaths and adverse outcomes for drug users. Unfortunately, it being a really, prohibition, I think the fundamental idea of prohibition is to try to make this as deadly as possible. In fact, there are people in the DEA that have been quoted saying such things, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't even affect the demand. The demand stays the same, just more people die. Anyway, okay. I'm going to cover reagent testing very quickly. Because I think it's something that you really need like a harm reduction person to do for you to do well. But you also can do it yourself to a certain degree. And I encourage that if people want to take it upon themselves. And I'd be happy to provide that training to anyone that's interested. It's generally the most cost-effective way to identify common adulterants in misidentified samples. Generally, reagents, what I mean by a reagent, it's a strong acid mixed with a chemical that changes color in the presence of certain substances. So this is an example of what's called the Marquis reagent. It's just one of the many different kinds of these chemicals that turn certain colors in certain substances. In this case, Marquis is formaldehyde mixed with sulfuric acid. Just fun fact. And then this list of color spectrums behind. So that's what I'm talking about. So like you would see, let's say you have a sample, you put it on there, it turns purple to black, which is what's on top here, the first thing. So I would suggest that it's MDMA. But then you'd want to do more testing. You don't want to just use one reagent for many reasons. Okay. Where can you find a test kit? So these are all places. I'll send out this PowerPoint for people, but I'm really just pulling this from the NAPS harm reduction guide that I wrote last year. So it's also there. DanceSafe is the one I recommend. I'm obviously biased to DanceSafe, but the money that you use to buy those kits goes to help us test more people's drugs. Which I think is just good in general. Oh, also you can just find me, and I put the QR code there again. It's going to come up a lot. How to use the test kit. I'm not going to go over the demo today. There just isn't enough time. There's some information here. Once again, I will train you or just do the test for you. So the only way to get really good results that specify both the quantity and the purity of your sample is to submit them to testing. And I've realized now that I've missed an important piece of information. Oh, I know, I just skipped it. So what you got to know about reagent tests specifically is that they're basically a confirmatory test. So if you suspect that you have MDMA, you can run it through all these different drops. And if all those drops look like it would be if it was MDMA, then you have evidence to suggest that it might be MDMA or a similar compound. You don't know how much MDMA is in that sample. You don't know if there's a small amount of something else in that sample. So you don't know the potency, the purity, and you don't know for sure if there aren't any like really low quantity adulterants that are in there, like fentanyl or something. So that's obviously limited. So lab testing is one of the ways to get around that. They're relatively expensive to send them in, but I think it's worth it if you have enough sample to work with. So drugs data, it was formerly part of Aeroid, I think. And what you do, so you send them in a certain amount, I think it's like 100 milligrams, probably depends on the drug, and a certain amount of money, I think it's like $100, probably also depends on the drug. And then what they'll do is they'll post your results, the results of their GCMS testing, which stands for gas chromatography mass spectrometry. It's a kind of analysis that you can use to figure out what's in the thing. They'll post those results online and then tell you where your results can be found. Unfortunately, if you're sending it from the United States, they won't give you quantitative data. We can thank the DEA and their absurdity for that. But interesting fact, if you use the return address somewhere outside the United States, you can get quantitative data. Okay. Also, new kid on the block, Energy Control International, provides a very similar sort of service. And I can give you all links to that if you ever need, but you can also just look up energy control drug testing, and it should get you there. I've been testing people's drugs for 7 years now, and I have heard many, many, many reasons for why people won't do it. So I thought I will just try to address them and see if that lands with people. Probably the most common one is I trust my dealer. Some variation of he tested for me, she gets it from a reliable source, they've been a close friend for years, something along those lines. Keep in mind that in all likelihood, your dealer probably doesn't actually know what is in their stuff, right? So like they could be getting it from their person who they think is a reliable source, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in my opinion, a lot of the fentanyl contaminations and things are accidental. They're not intentional and people don't know about it. So even if they've been a close friend for years, they don't have any problem giving you drugs that might have a little bit of fentanyl in there because they don't know what's in there. I think really good examples to kind of like counteract this. So like examples of people that have died from accidental fentanyl contamination, Prince, Mac Miller, right? These people had, if any people had reliable sources to drugs, they were these people, right? And I'm sure that when they told themselves like, I get it from a reliable source or my guy can be trusted or whatever, that they believed that, right? But it didn't work out for them, right? And I don't think there's any reason to suspect that any of us have a better connect than Mac Miller. So the whole point of that is just trust. You can trust your people, but verify, but test your stuff, right? You might save them inadvertently anyway. Next one. So another reason people won't test their drugs is they say, I don't do those kinds of drugs. What they're referring to is sort of usually is the impression that those types of dangerous additives are only being found in like street heroin, for instance, or like maybe they've recognized that it's in cocaine. The reality is that it's, spreading to everything. And while like cannabis and psilocybin mushrooms and things that grow out of the ground are probably going to be protected for a lot longer, fentanyl and other high potency contaminants are spreading actively into other things, and they're going to spread into whatever you like as long as it's synthetic and it's synthesized somewhere and you didn't make it yourself, and so that one doesn't really work for me either. I mean, there are certain, like if you're buying legal cannabis from a dispensary, I think it's fair to not worry about fentanyl contamination. But if what you're saying is like, oh, I only do MDMA, then I don't think that that's really a protection that you don't do those kinds of drugs. This one I actually get surprisingly more often than you'd think, that people say they do test it. And what they mean is they just take a little bit of it, or they have someone else take a little bit of it, and see if, I don't know, they die. I guess that's what the strategy is. Unfortunately, high potency cuts like fentanyl can really be anywhere in the sample. Several people could try a batch before you and be totally fine because they didn't get enough of that fentanyl or that cut for it to be dangerous for them. But then you could get the line that's deadly, right? Or same thing with just snorting a little bit. You could try that a little bit, but it's somewhere else in the sample. Yeah, so just to say, you should test your drugs whenever possible. The last one is just cognitive dissonance. I think that's really a large part of it, right? It's like really scary what's happening, and people want to be able to relax or alter themselves in whatever way they want to, and they don't want to have to actively worry about their mortality in those situations. And I see that it's sometimes easier just to not know. But I really would like to try to change that and like try to create some like real conversation around the expectation that you shouldn't have to risk your life every time you consume psychoactive substances. I kind of see this as a similar reason we seem to avoid getting medical tests, if we're like afraid that they're going to show something. Yeah, anyway, so it's just to say like 120,000 people, more than that, died last year. And I assure you that many of those people said things like this when conversations around doing substance testing came up. Okay.
We're going to be covering how to use fentanyl test strips today. First, let me just talk briefly about what is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a highly potent synthetic opioid that has been showing up as contamination or adulteration inside of a lot of illicit drug samples recently. It's been used as a medicine in the medical field for decades, but it's only recently found its way into our drug supply. The problem with it is that it's so potent, and since there is a risk profile for opioids, that consuming a very small amount of fentanyl accidentally can lead to serious adverse outcomes, an overdose or even a death. It takes about 250 micrograms of fentanyl to have a potentially fatal overdose. It very much depends on your tolerance and a lot of other factors. But that's just to communicate that a very, very small amount of fentanyl can be really, really problematic for users. So we're going to show you how to test your samples for fentanyl. Okay, so the best way to test your sample for fentanyl are these immunoassay strips. We'll show in a second, but they're these little strips that can detect fentanyl when it's suspended in water at up to or down to 20 nanograms per milliliter. So for reference, it goes grams, milligrams, micrograms, and then nanograms. There's 1,000 nanograms in a microgram, meaning that we can pick up about a 10,000th of the fatal dose of fentanyl with one of these strips. So that's going to be a huge advantage to us. Now, the important thing to remember about fentanyl is since it's such a tiny amount that can cause you a problem, it can be distributed anywhere within your sample. So for example here, we have a bag. This is a bag of sugar. And inside of this bag of sugar, I have put a single sesame seed. Now, this sesame seed, if it was fentanyl, would be white, just like the rest of the powder, but that sesame seed would be enough to potentially be a fatal overdose. Now, if I was to take only a small amount of this powder out, say 10 milligrams, and put it in my water to test it, if I got a negative result, that wouldn't tell me for sure whether there was fentanyl somewhere else in the sample. So the only way to make sure that you're catching any fentanyl that might be in your sample is to test the entirety of what you intend to consume. So to dilute all of that in water and go from there. Anything short of that, you might miss some of the fentanyl that's somewhere else in your sample. So for this is about 100 milligrams of powder, and I've weighed that out ahead of time. You can tell roughly, a rough way to figure out what 10 milligrams is versus 100 milligrams we have an image of a penny here, and covering Abraham Lincoln's face is about 10 milligrams of powder. So this would be about 10 times that, and it's the entirety of what I intend to consume. So then I would take that and put the entire sample into a little cup or some sort of container. Ideally, I find it best to have use containers that have milliliter gradations on the side, or teaspoon gradations or something. And that will help you get the dilutions right as you go through. Okay, so now we have this in here. The ideal dilution, unless you're testing amphetamines, which we'll talk about later, is 10 milligrams per milliliter. Now, for reference, so 10 milligrams, we have the little picture of a penny. For a milliliter, very roughly, 1 milliliter is a quarter of a teaspoon. So if you take a quarter of a teaspoon, you can measure that out, and that would be about a milliliter. So for 100 milligrams of powder, we're going to want about 2 teaspoons of water. That stays at 10 milligrams per milliliter. So I have my water here. I've got a full teaspoon here. Put 2 of those. Set it aside. Now I'm going to take a stir stick of some kind. I'm going to make sure that it's entirely dissolved, or as much as I possibly can get it to be dissolved. So you want it to be as dissolved as possible. Now, if your sample was a crystal or it had chunks in it, you're going to want to crush it up before you put it in the solution to make sure it all fully dissolves, or it dissolves as much as you can. Any of the sample that hasn't been fully dissolved in the water isn't necessarily going to get picked up by the fentanyl testing strip. Okay, so now I've dissolved my sample, about 2 teaspoons of water, 100 milligrams of powder. Take the fentanyl testing strip. I'm going to open it up. And as you'll see here, there's a blue end, a solid blue end, and you're going to hold it by that. We'll show a graphic too. Hold it by that. And then there's this blue line with waves underneath it. You want to submerge the strip into the liquid only up to that blue line before the waves. So I'm going to insert it in now and stir it gently. I'm going to do that for about 15 seconds. Again, notice that I'm not putting the strip deeper into the water than those wavy blue lines. All right, that was about 15 seconds. And then I'm going to lay the strip down flat, ideally on the packaging or somewhere that it's not just directly on the table. And we're going to let the water move up the strip with capillary action. We're going to leave it there for about 2 minutes, and then we'll go to interpreting the results. Okay, after you've waited 2 minutes and you're looking at your strip, the way to interpret the results is that one line, the line farthest up towards the solid blue end that you're holding, that line, if it's positive, it'll just be that one line. If it's negative, 2 lines will show up. So positive, 1 line, negative, 2 lines. If you get anything other than those 2 results, then the test is invalid. Importantly, if that second line is visible at all, even if it's faint, that is a negative result. Okay, depending on what you want to consume and how, some users won't want to submerge their entire sample in water. Now again, this is the only way to be 100% sure you've caught the fentanyl in your sample, if it is in your sample. But some people are preferring to snort their sample, whatever they have. They don't want to drink it in water. And in those cases, the second best option, again, not the best option, but the second best option, is to test the residue that's sticking on the inside of the bag from the sample. So what you do there, you'll take your sample, your entire sample, you'll take a second bag that you've brought with you. You'll empty your sample into the other bag. And then you'll notice, just as I said, that there is going to be static that's holding little bits of the powder on the inside of the bag. Now the hope here is that the stuff on the inside of the bag will act as a random sampling of the entire sample. So you're hoping that you've caught a little bit of that fentanyl on the sides of the bag. And since our strips are so sensitive to fentanyl, if you've caught any of the fentanyl and you dilute it appropriately, hopefully you'll catch it. Now, this bag, whatever is on the inside of here is probably under 10 milligrams. And again, you want to dilute it to about 10 milligrams per milliliter. The closest we can get in the field is going to be a quarter of a teaspoon, which again is going to be a little bit more than a milliliter, so it's not quite exact. But luckily, the strips, again, 20 nanograms per milliliter, the strips are so sensitive that hopefully, as long as you're attempting to get the dilutions correct, you're going to still be able to successfully catch any fentanyl that's in your sample. So I have my bag here. I'm going to go ahead and take the quarter teaspoon, put it directly in the bag. Now we're going to want to move it around, shake it up, try to get it as many places as we can to catch all of that if we can. Take the bag, take the water, put it in your glass, just like before. Take your fentanyl strip. We're just reusing the strip here, but you can use a new strip. You should use a new strip. Stir it around again for 15 seconds, holding it at the solid blue end and not submerging the strip past the wavy blue lines. And then after you've done that for about 15 seconds and you've made sure you've gotten plenty of the water on the tip of the strip, you put it down and you wait for 2 minutes to see how your result comes out. Again, one strip or one line is positive, 2 lines is negative. Okay, say the way that you intend to consume your sample is with a needle, either intramuscular or intravenous or subcutaneous or however you'd like to inject it. In those cases, you're at a slight advantage with fentanyl testing because you already have to submerge your sample in liquid in order to shoot it. So this here is a cooker. Many people will use a cooker like this or maybe a spoon to sterilize their sample before they inject it. So what you can do is you can go through your normal process of setting up your shot with your cooker or your spoon, pull out the liquid into the shot, and then what we're going to do is test the residue that's on the inside of the cooker or the spoon. So again, since we're testing residue, it's going to be probably less than 10 milligrams, so we're not going to want more than a milliliter of fluid in this cooker. I'm using here a distilled water capsule. The advantages of these are 1, that the water is clean, and 2, that it's already measured in milliliters on the side, which is probably hard to see. But that will make it easier for me to make sure that the measurements are correct. So we've prepared our shot, we've drawn it out into our needle. Now we're going to take a quarter of a teaspoon, fill it up with water, put it in our cooker. Then we're going to take our fentanyl testing strip, brand new one obviously. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to stir it around for about 15 seconds. And then once we've done it for about 15 seconds, we're going to take it out, put it here, wait 2 minutes for the results. And again, this is a strip we've already used, so we can see here 1 line is positive, 2 lines is negative. All right, so one trick here is that if you're testing amphetamines, they can trigger a false positive on the fentanyl testing strips unless you adjust the dilution. So for things that are amphetamines like Adderall or speed or meth or something along those lines, you're going to want to dilute to 2 milligrams per milliliter. So reference, that would be about 1 full teaspoon of water per 10 milligrams of powder. There's also many street drugs that, while they are not actually amphetamines, are often cut with amphetamines. So cocaine, for instance, or MDMA will often have methamphetamine in it as a byproduct if it's being made. And so for those specific instances, if you get a positive result and it's one of those drugs like meth or MDMA or potentially cocaine that could be cut with amphetamine, then what you want to do is do an additional test where you dilute it again about 5 times, which you originally had, from 10 milligrams per milliliter down to 2 milligrams per milliliter, and then do the test again. You want to be really careful here because obviously you don't want to just be increasing the dilutions of your samples until you get negative results and then just move on. You want to be able to tell whether or not those negative results are real. So don't over dilute. But if you're testing methamphetamine, MDMA, or potentially cocaine, if it has amphetamine in it, then you might need to do another test to make sure that your positive was not a false positive. All right, say that you want to test a pill. either a pharmaceutical pill or a pressed pill from the street or anything along those lines. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to crush it up. I find the easiest way to do that is to take some sort of piece of paper. I'm using an index card here. Fold it up, put the pill inside of that, and then use a lighter or a spoon or something along those lines to crush up the pill. Almost lost it. You want to crush it up as finely as you can. And then because you're going to be taking this pill orally anyway, you're going to want to test the entire sample because you can just drink it and it'll have the exact same effect as taking the pill. And again, that's the only way to ensure that you're being really safe. So I take my little cup, put the entire sample in there. In this case, this pill was about 100 milligrams. So to dilute it to 10 milligrams per milliliter, we need about 2 teaspoons of water. So I'll take 1, 2. I'll take my stir stick, stir it around thoroughly. Now, one thing important to remember about any sort of like pressed pills or pharmaceutical pills is that the binding agent, which is what they're using to keep the pill together besides the drug itself, those binding agents are often not soluble in water. So it's not going to mix perfectly. And importantly, and this is a limitation of testing any sort of pressed pill, there is always the possibility that the binding agent is encasing the fentanyl that's in the pill, and you won't be able to successfully test it this way. So there is a risk that you'll get a false negative by testing these pills. So now I've dissolved this as much as I think it will. There's a little bit of binding agent floating on the top. Do the same thing, take a fresh strip, hold it by the blue end, stir it around for about 15 seconds. Pretend that was 15 seconds. And then we'll put it down, wait for the capillary action to take the result up the strip. 1 line is positive, 2 lines is negative. And that's how you test a press pill.
Okay, and now we're back to this part. Okay, where can I find fentanyl test strips? You can find them with me again, or at any of these other places. They cost about $1 to $2 in bulk. You can get them for maybe 80 cents a strip, and yeah, they're super useful. And yeah, as I mentioned in the video, you want to test your whole sample if you want to catch the fentanyl for sure. It's going to be in there, right? The downside is that means now all of a sudden you have all this aqueous drugs, right? Like, how do I take MDMA with me to a show and wait till I'm in there to take it if it's in liquid form, right? Real issue. And one of the ways that I found around it is these little plastic leak tight screw cap things. You ideally want them to be amber, really, because like UV could be a problem depending on long-term storage, but at least for a short-term method, I think this makes things a lot more realistic. Just make sure you keep track of how much water you've used to dilute. You should be keeping track of that anyway, the dilution ratios. But even if you, let's say, to do the test, you need like a half cup of water, you can like divide that up into individual doses or individual shots according to like making sure you know how much water you put in to begin with and dividing down. Okay, I wanted to mention this because it's super awesome. There's a new dance safe fentanyl test strip, and it does not false flag for amphetamines, which is huge. It means if you're testing your stuff, everything is 10 milligrams per milliliter. Huge deal. Can't say enough about it. I think it's really going to help people trust the results of their strips. Yeah, so if you're going to buy some fentanyl test strips, buy some dance safe fentanyl test strips. They're not all the same anymore. It was the case that it was just the urinalysis strips they used for parole, but now it's special. Now we have our own, and they work better. Okay, proceed with caution. So even after you've tested your drugs, there may be important pieces of information you lack. For instance, purity. As a result, you should always proceed cautiously with every new sample of every substance. Like the first time you have a batch from the new guy, or even the guy you would normally go to, but you got a new batch, you should proceed these ways. This should proceed cautiously. especially, I'd say this is also especially true if it's your first experience with a substance or any substances. Okay, first, do your own research. And I mean your own research because it is your health. So for any substance that's unfamiliar, you want to do thorough research on the effects, average dosing, possible adverse side effects, and any harm reduction practices specific to the substance. The following are excellent sources of information in terms of anecdotal reports. So Arrowwood, Blue Light. I want to highlight Psychonaut Wiki because they do this cool thing where they provide these total like dosages and durations estimates for a lot of the drugs on their site. Again, you shouldn't use those as gospel, but they provide a good like baseline context. It's always possible that your experience will differ significantly from any report, scientific or anecdotal, but getting a sense for other people's experiences with a substance will always help you avoid some potential dangers. Also, in terms of doing your own research, you should always check for medication contraindications. Medication contraindications. This is something you always have to do your own research with, right? Like everyone is different and everyone's on different medications. And even like if you're on 2 meds, it might be different than if you're just on one or the other. So you got to do your own research with this and be very careful. But I just wanted to speak to some things that I think are some common issues in the psychedelic world, common questions. So first, psychedelics and SSRIs, SNRIs, or TCAs, which are tricyclic antidepressants, there actually is not any convincing evidence of toxicity of like serotonin syndrome when people combine these. That is kind of the commonly held belief, but the science isn't there and the reports in hospitals aren't there. And yeah, there's a lot missing. What we do know is that there is likely going to be a blunted psychedelic effect if you're on one of those antidepressant medications while you take a psychedelic. The MDMA, that's especially true for. This is a little chart from the scientific paper that I pulled this claim from. Basically what you're seeing is there's a lot of like Prozac, Paxil, Celexa, like a lot of very common medications, and you see all of them have a negative impact, except for Wellbutrin. All of them have a negative impact on MDMA subjective effect. But if you'll notice, there's still often increases in blood pressure or increases in body temperature or other things that are associated with it. And that's how people get into trouble. Oftentimes is they're like at the club and they're trying to roll and they can't because they're on Prozac. And so they keep taking the MDMA to try to overwhelm it. But the physical effects that MDMA carries with it because of its amphetamine properties start to cause a physical overdose. Plus also like heat stroke and all kinds of other things. Okay, just because there's no proof of major serotonin syndrome with antidepressants and psychedelics doesn't mean that they're a great idea to combine. They definitely don't combine well. But just in terms of like, is this person going to end up in the hospital because they're on Prozac and they took some psilocybin? There isn't a lot of evidence that would suggest that's the case or would be the case. Next, psychedelics and MAOIs. MAOIs are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which I'm not going to totally explain now, but they're often used as antidepressants or mood stabilizers. This is danger zone with psychedelic combinations. This does have evidence that it can cause serotonin syndrome and other hospital level dangerous interactions that come with it. So that's something to be watchful for. Ayahuasca, not the vine, but the drink that includes the vine, has an MAOI in it, although I guess that is vine. So ayahuasca vine is an MAOI, and therefore it cannot be combined with many things, antidepressants being one major one. But even things like bananas are contraindicated before or during an ayahuasca experience. Other pharmaceuticals that seem to have some kind of effect with psychedelics, so trazodone, Remeron, Wellbutrin, a lot of these are showing blunted effects. For MDMA, Wellbutrin is actually showing a synergistic effect. So it's all over the place. Also, any sedative with any other sedative is physically dangerous. So like if you're drinking, you shouldn't be taking benzos. If you're on ketamine, you shouldn't be drinking. The way that you end up having a physical overdose is often for mixing sedatives. It's a very common reason people overdose that way. This is probably my favorite practice, and I think everyone should do it all the time. You should, whenever you're doing anything, you should always start at a low dose and slowly work up from there. It avoids so many problems. So certainly for every batch of every new substance, you should do that. First of all, it'll help you notice potentially dangerous contaminants before you take a fatal dose, right? So you might get 100 micrograms of fentanyl before you get 250, and then you notice and you don't end up dying. Also, it will avoid you getting higher than you want it to be because you don't know the purity of what you're testing, which has lots of reasonable problems associated with it. Okay, so particularly with new substances, either new to the user or new to the world, like novel substances, it's highly recommended that the user slowly increase dose with a significant amount of time, at least days in between each session. So instead of like in the same night taking a little bit and then taking more until you're where you're at, you actually first do what's called an allergy test, which is where you take about 1/10 of the lowest dose range of the drug, and you know the lowest dose range because you've done your own thorough research on this drug, right? That helps you avoid a potential allergic reaction to the substance, which does happen. Also, if it's not what you thought it was, right? Like if you thought it was 2CE and instead it's 2C bromo dragonfly, that has a vastly different dosage range, that will help you there too. Now, threshold testing. So then you try that, assuming it all goes well, you wait a couple days, and then you can at least a couple days, and then you try again with what's called threshold testing, which is you take just as much as you think will be psychoactive. And again, you know this because you've done your own thorough research. If you have a strong experience with that, what you thought was a threshold dose, then that's probably the dose that you want, or maybe even a little bit less. If you have no experience or an underwhelming one, then you can go back several days later and try a higher dosage. And this really helps, I'd say, primarily with, even if you know what people generally take a drug at, what dosage, you don't necessarily know if that's your dosage, because everyone is different and your brain is different and your biology is different. And so you really should always start low and go slow. Okay, next thing. Never use alone. Use a sober sitter. This is for psychedelics specifically. There's so many reasons to use a sober sitter. Let me see here. What did I even put? Okay, yeah, so it's the trip sitter's responsibility to assist the individual or group by maintaining a calm and grounded frame of mind. This can be accomplished simply by watching over the trippers and kindly reassuring them of their experience if they experience any anxiety or stress. I'd say a quality trip sitter, the ideal person would make sure that you stay hydrated, that someone around you that you like, the sitter is oriented to time and space, because the journeyer might not be. They ensure that you remain physically safe in the space. So for instance, if you suddenly want to jump from the second story window, they will disallow that. And also they make sure that someone is there who's grounded and has the space to emotionally support you through potentially difficult experiences. And I just said to look for in a sitter, you want them to be responsible, sober, and experienced. Especially in terms of sober, I think there's a temptation to like say, oh, I have a sober sitter if someone who knows more or has done this more is tripping with me. And I would really encourage you not to have someone who actually is not on a psychedelic, because it's unpredictable. You never know if this person who's done psilocybin 15 times and you've never done it before is going to have their 16th trip be totally unexpected and overwhelming. And, you really want them to be with it. Okay, importantly, if you don't have anyone to watch you, if you're like, I want to do drugs by myself, which again, not recommended. The Fireside Project provides psychedelic peer support over the phone. You can go to Fireside Project, or they have an app. You start the app before you get into space. They have a very easy way to interact with the app so that you can call them, which I think is excellent because you're probably on drugs. And they'll help talk you through it. There are a couple important conversations that I think need to happen with your sober sitter. There's only a couple of them. So one is like the level of involvement, like how involved do you want this person to be? Like, are you looking for guidance or support or just like physical safety assurance, right? Like to make sure that you don't harm yourself, but otherwise you don't want them involved, or, have those conversations. And whatever you imagine, make sure that you're making that specific and explicit with your sitter. Also, it's more to talk about touch. If you want touch to be a potential part of your journey, like hand holding or something, like you really want to talk about that as much as you can with your sitter and make sure that your sitter has thought about their own boundaries and thought about your boundaries and everything's been talked about before you're in an altered state, because things can get dicey once you are altered and trying to navigate that kind of stuff. Importantly, in my opinion, I guess, my ethics, when you agree to something outside of session, like outside of the actual trip, you can always rescind a yes to something that you've agreed to outside of session. Like you can say, no, I don't want my hand held anymore or whatever. But you can't rescind a no that you've done before you started, right? So if you're beforehand, you're like, no, I really don't want you to touch me at all. But then you're in the space and you're like, I really want you to hold my hand. That no should be respected from when you were sober. In terms of emergency response, I think it's also really important. People don't want to talk about the worst case scenario, but they really should talk about the worst case scenario. Like, do you have an emergency contact? Is there a person that sitter should reach out to if you're, unconscious or they've taken you to the hospital or something? Do you have any allergies? If you have any allergies, do you have an EpiPen? Like, things like that. Emergency response procedures, like under what conditions will your sitter call 911? Yeah, and then what to look for in a sitter. I really do think that like inviting a person to share a psychedelic experience with you is like super vulnerable and something you should take very seriously. And so,
Brendan, we got a question in the chat about allergies.
do you know anything about some of the most common recreational drug allergies? What are those likely to show up? Any cofactors that you've noticed? So generally, if an allergy is going to emerge to a substance itself, that you're going to find that out really fast. Like that person will have usually like a fairly major reaction right away. And so that's where the starting low, going slow allergy testing thing is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. They are very rare, but they like have happened. For instance, like somebody connected to my family when he was very young, died of an allergic reaction to smoking DMT. And like, we have no idea what happened. We don't know if there was anything else in there. But that's actually a really great example because that person died from that allergic reaction because the other 20 somethings around him were too intoxicated to respond to his allergic reaction. And so, yeah, he needed a sober sitter. So they needed someone there to be protective. So this is just to say they kind of come out of nowhere. A lot of the allergies that I've seen for people in like the sitter kind of context are going to come up where like the sober sitter thinks they're being really helpful by bringing pretzels for the person to eat later if they want to, because like eating can be a good grounding tool. And then they haven't talked about the fact that that person is like allergic to gluten or something along those lines. It's more been like exposure is outside of that context. There's also a possibility of allergies to things that's like mixed into the substance. And in those cases, you'll see more like, let's say it's like a 10 or 15% cut in the cocaine or whatever. That person might have an allergic reaction like quite a ways into using the substance before they hit an amount that was actually triggering an allergy. I wish I knew more about how to notice if that's going to happen or not. Every time I've ever seen an allergy to a drug like that in a recreational setting, everyone is shocked that it's happened. And so all I can say is just be prepared, and it might be a good idea to have like an EpiPen, or if that person has any kind of proneness to allergies, to bring in the EpiPen. Yeah. So the vast majority of fatal overdoses could be avoided if someone else who was sober enough to act was present. And that's important, right? Like never use alone. Also, that person needs to be sober enough to help you, right? So for opioids, that person can deliver Narcan. They can call an ambulance. We'll cover some of that stuff. They can very much save your life. I want to talk briefly about ketamine. It really has been growing in use in the community, and I have heard more than once this mythology that you cannot overdose on ketamine. While it is true that ketamine on its own is very difficult to physically overdose on, you'd have to take more than most people I think have ever even gotten close to. At a much lower dose, a dose that recreational users reach on a regular basis, I would say, you are too anesthetized to help yourself. And so what happens is that people are significantly anesthetized and they roll over or they slump in their chair and they block their airway. They throw up and choke on their vomit. They choke on their own spit. Someone not too long ago drowned on the beach. They fell into the sand and that blocked their airway sufficiently enough that they, and that has really been happening. And so it is important to know that you really shouldn't use ketamine alone, because it isn't like a MDMA or a psilocybin kind of psychedelic. Like there are reasons that you can physically die from consuming this drug. But if literally any of those people had someone to roll them over, right, or even just like clear their airway if they vomited, right, like put them in the recovery position, then those deaths wouldn't have happened. That person would have had probably a decently pleasant ketamine experience. So I wanted to mention ketamine. With benzos, if it really is a benzo and you really are overdosing on it, the best they can do is call an ambulance. Those are very dangerous drugs to overdose on. There's not a lot we can do for you. Ways to avoid using alone. I want to be totally realistic about this because I understand there might be some temptation to use alone anyway. First, trade off with your using buddies. So let's say we're doing ketamine, for instance, right? You're going to need, if you're doing it up your nose, you're going to need about 30 minutes before you're through it enough to potentially like move and interact with the world, right? So you go back and forth. Your friend does it, you wait 30 minutes, they come out of it, you do it, and then they watch you. You can watch each other. That is an option. I think the way that usually falls apart is that if people are serious enough about their using, they refuse to wait. And that is tragic. And so you got, to some degree, you have to trust your using buddy. Next thing, and this I emphasize a lot, and I know it's going to sound really hard to imagine, but let people know that you're using. Like even if you're sober and you feel like you're about to relapse, like go tell someone that lives in your house. And unfortunately, we live in a situation where they might try to stop you or shame you, and you don't want to be stopped or shamed, and so you won't tell anyone. And we need to shift that as a community and as a culture. That needs to change. And I really genuinely believe that that's one of the only ways that we're going to actually be able to help each other and some of these people. Think about how many teenagers who accidentally overdosed on fentanyl could have survived that experience if the mom downstairs in the kitchen knew that their child was smoking heroin and that's what they were doing. Now, I know it sounds crazy that a mom would know that and let their kid do it, but if the emphasis and the importance is on the kid staying alive, then I argue that that is absolutely what is necessary. Support your loved ones, encourage them not to use in secrecy. They cannot recover if they're already dead. If you still in a situation where you're going to use alone, because realistically, that might happen. There is a hotline called the Never Use Alone hotline. It's right there. You dial it, you tell them your address, you tell them what you're more or less up to, and they'll be checking in with you verbally throughout that experience. And if they get to a point where they can't get anything out of you, then they'll send EMS to your house. It was invented to use for heroin users, but the Never Use Alone hotline has come to realize that people are dying from all kinds of different drugs now, many of the times because of fentanyl. And so if you call them and say, I'm taking some Molly and I'm 99% sure that this isn't going to kill me, but I want to make sure that if something happens, they'll know, right? They will say yes, and they will keep on the line with you. Do not feel like you are not a serious enough user to use these services. I guarantee you, many of the people who have died felt that they were not serious enough users to take some of these things seriously. Okay, be prepared. So it's always a possibility that you or someone near you will have serious adverse reactions to a substance. Even if you don't use drugs commonly regarded as dangerous, serious reactions can occur unexpectedly. You can greatly reduce the harms associated with these adverse reactions by taking simple steps to be prepared for them. Okay, if the rest of this presentation wasn't triggering enough, this is the most triggering part of the presentation. This is the piece of the presentation where I will be very frankly discussing topics related to overdose. For many, myself included, this is a deeply personal and tragic subject. If anyone would prefer to skip to the final section, raise your Zoom hand and one of our people will put you in the Zoom waiting room and we'll bring you back in. Yeah, while it is difficult to discuss, I know this information is important, and I feel avoiding discussion of it creates the false impression that serious drug reactions can only happen to certain users with certain drugs, and therefore can be left out of a harm reduction conversation among psychedelic users. For one, I would never assume NAPS members only consume serotonergic psychedelics. And for two, because of adulteration and misidentification, even substances without a known overdose threshold can cause serious reactions. What I'm going to cover today is trip killers for psychedelic experiences, risk factors for physical overdose, and how to respond to an opiate overdose. So let's say like this isn't someone that you've been with the whole time necessarily. Let's say you found them, like you're at a festival or you're in the dorms or you're in your apartment and the next door neighbor knocks on your door, or, something happens. And this person who you didn't help set their original setting is now in front of you and they're not doing well and they're on some kind of psychedelic, or they're, not grounded in default reality. So here's some ideas. And this is not like you must do this. This is a standard operating procedure. This is what I would do. And my experience with this is from working at festivals. So first is change the setting. That's the number one thing, 100%. So change the music, get some cushions, get some sofa, get some squish going on, like have it be comfortable, blankets, pillows. I mean, it depends on what kind of energy level the person's at. They might not be ready to lay down, but you'll just see. Temperature control is big. I can't tell you how many people I've seen have a bad time that was like mostly because they were cold. Or like things like that. Using power objects of your own can be really helpful in that kind of space too. Your buying into their power can often lend to other people in the psychedelic state buying into their power. Smells are a really powerful way to help people access grounding. Incense, essential oils. Rescue remedy is one that I really like as an option for people. Tea is really good. In terms of music, and I'm glad that Tate is here to hear me say this. So I'm going to recommend strongly the album And Their Refinement of the Decline by Stars of the Lid as music to put on to help someone come down or relax a little bit more, I should say. It really is quite wonderful. I also, before getting that recommendation from Tate, really relied on Tycho's album Awake, and I found that one to be also quite effective, especially that first song. Second one, this is a Zendo principle, talk through, not down. And that basically just means like there's a temptation in that case to tell someone, oh, it's not a problem, don't worry, you're fine, like just stop worrying or something like that. And that's not really helpful in that kind of state. Generally, the person needs to have the experience they're having and move through it in order to resolve it. And they, in an attempt to face that, have maybe lost their way or fractured or who knows, right? But supporting them in surrendering and accepting what's happening to them is really the best thing you can do in that situation. Your personal belief, if this is the case, that that they can handle it, right? Like that they can get through it. That's really true. Just that having that confidence and that energy can be really helpful for people in that kind of state because they're kind of panicked. If someone is really big, like let's say the issue is that they're being really loud and they're running all over the place and they're kind of scaring people or something. Something that I was taught with Zendo and that I've used quite a few times and it is miraculously effective is mirroring that person's energy, right? So let's say the person like comes to the sanctuary tent and they're running around and they're jumping and they're screaming and stuff, right? You start by mirroring that, by trying to like match their energy, right? And then once they kind of see that you're involved in it too, you like slowly like down regulate just by having your own nervous system involved and help them work out what's happening. Trying to force someone that's having a very big externalizing energetic psychedelic experience to like sit down and like get zen can often be really counterproductive, ineffective, and probably not super ethical. And so mirroring their energy, at least initially, to whatever degree is safe for you in a safe space, minimizes that shame and that kind of opposition that they've probably been facing up until that point of people telling them they're too much. And it helps to work out a lot of excess energy. The fourth thing I'd recommend, and this is just pretty much universal, classic neuropa thing to say, get them into their bodies. A lot of times when people are having a difficult psychedelic time, depends on what they're on, but a lot of times it's thought loops or some kind of other feedback loop, right? Where they're having emotions and thoughts that are feeding back on each other and they're really, really stuck. If you come into that situation and provide another cognitive reframing for them, like just back and forth, like, I'm dying. The person's like, I'm dying. And you're like, you're not dying. And you're like, I'm dying. And I'm not dying, back and forth because you keep telling them they're not dying. You keep telling them they're safe. That can go on until the person's done tripping. I have seen that. And so getting them into their bodies, getting curious about their experience, drawing awareness to their experience is really the best way to go. Because then you're sort of not operating as like another node in this like permanent feedback loop that's happening. So an example would be person comes in, they're like, I'm dying. And you might tell them a couple times, like, you're safe here, like, this physical space, like I can tell you you're not dying. But then each time you say that, they're like, I'm dying, I'm dying, I'm dying. Try to say like, what does dying feel like? Or, how is that experience like for you? Or, something along those lines, drawing their awareness to their experience which will hopefully help them additionally process it and move through it. And then lastly, food accelerates landing, especially if they're in like the last hour, 2 hours of their experience. You can really speed it up by starting their metabolism. Citrus fruits, crunchy things, whatever they'll eat, if they'll eat, can be really helpful. Okay, a lot of people don't know about trip killers, and they really can be quite helpful. So this is specifically for those serotonin psychedelics. So there's so many of them, but for instance, ketamine is not one of those. So yeah, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, 2CB, 2CE, DMT. I don't know if DMT would really come into play here, but yeah. Okay, so for that class of drugs specifically, benzodiazepines and certain antipsychotics can reliably end a trip as they take effect, like stop it in its tracks. An example would be Xanax or Klonopin. Those are two benzos. Zyprexa is an antipsychotic. The problem with this, I should say, so the kind of reason I think this is not often discussed, the fact that trip killers can exist, is because many experienced users advise waiting out difficult parts of a trip for as long as possible, because these moments are often temporary and later turn out to be like the greatest learning experiences from the psychedelic experience. So it's difficult to know like if that's even like helpful to someone. And I should mention that benzos, and these antipsychotics, are not a low risk class of drugs. You really can't combine them with any other sedatives. So you have to know what the person is on or what yourself is on. You have to know all kinds of things in order to use them safely. And I think that's also part of it, right? Because if you give a Xanax to someone that's already on a bunch of benzos or already on opiates or something like that, you can turn a psychological crisis from the psychedelic into a physical crisis from the physical overdose. And you don't want to take one from one to the other. But in the situation where the person is only on a serotonergic psychedelic and they're having what I would call a bad trip. Now, people say there are no bad trips, only difficult trips. I disagree with this. I have seen and experienced myself psychedelic experiences that were only traumatizing and only negative. And the negative effects from those psychedelic experiences can last for years for people. And when someone is truly deep in one of those experiences where they really do need to bail, I think that a trip killer can be a very harm reduction oriented practice. So this is just to let you know it exists. Benzodiazepines kill trips. They stop them from continuing. Okay. Overdose risk factors. These are essentially bad practices. These are things that you can do that will make it more likely that you will have an adverse reaction and end up somewhere like in the hospital. Okay, so mixing drugs is probably the biggest one. Especially, I want to mention this, many overdoses occur when people mix alcohol and benzodiazepines. That particular mix has killed quite a few people. And we don't have any Narcan for it. Like if you consume at that point, all we can do is pump your stomach and maybe give you some adrenaline to try to move through the experience. But it's a very dangerous combination. Alcohol with other downers is also really dangerous, painkillers, ketamine. Yeah. And so you definitely want to avoid mixing depressants with each other. You can check this chart. This is a cool chart. I don't know if everyone can even, it's super tiny. It exists on the NAPS harm reduction Google Drive, which I'll make sure I give everyone access to. But basically talks about, I know this chart well enough that I guess I can say, so in like the top left corner is a bunch of psychedelics in green. And if you notice, they all interact with each other pretty well. They're like either the blue with the arrow up means they're synergistic, and then the yellow means that there's like no interaction, or I think potentially like a caution because there could be some like negative interactions. And then when you get over here, so down here this is like alcohol and various other depressants, right? When you interact those with each other, the red are like dangerously fatal overdoses. Yeah, so you can look at something like that to figure that out. Next thing is the dosage. So any substance can be toxic at a high enough dose. And so there are many reasons that you might end up on a dangerous dose of a drug. One common reason is the user has overestimated their tolerance. Tolerance can decrease rapidly when someone's taken a break from using. Also for drugs with a high active versus lethal dose ratio, which means that the amount of the thing that you would have to take to get altered and the amount of thing you would have to take for it to kill you are very close to each other. That misestimation of their tolerance can be even worse. So like drugs like that would be heroin, benzos, alcohol. Those all have very small active to lethal dose ratios. Another common reason that people take too much is the user is unaware that the potency that what they're consuming, which again is difficult. Dangerous adulterants is another common problem. Yeah, fentanyl is a real concern. There's also, as I mentioned, some other things. So xylazine it's like ketamine, but it's potent to the microgram. It's been showing up in heroin on the East Coast recently, and heroin is usually where things show up first in terms of adulteration in the United States. There's also clolazolam, which is a microgram potent benzodiazepine that's been showing up in British Columbia in heroin. And any of those could work their way into our drug supply. And we don't have clolazolam testing strips, and we don't have Narcan for those drugs. So that's also a risk into the future. I just will mention right here, because I already said this thing, like, it is this problem of other stuff in our drugs is going to get worse. And the only way out is safe supply. And the only way to accomplish safe supply is either legalization or complete decriminalization with free provided, like full spectrum testing services, like in Portugal. But it's the tools that we have now, we're barely keeping up with how drugs are changing to try to help people. And we still have the highest overdose rate in the world. Like, we can't actually catch up. This is what I would call palliative care. That we're like currently engaged in. Anyway, okay, using alone, we already talked about that. Really a bad idea to use alone for so many reasons. Age and physical health obviously are going to impact your body's ability to manage drugs. Older people and or those with longer drug using careers are at increased risk for fatal overdose. We've done studies on that. Older people who overdose are less likely than younger people to survive that overdose as well. Also, if you're sick, like you have a compromised immune system or you have an infection or an abscess or something, this also puts you at a higher risk of overdose. Dehydration, not eating, not sleeping, all those things increase your risk. And mode of administration. So there's many ways to get psychoactive substances to your brain, and they all come with their own advantages and disadvantages. So we can discuss this in more depth if anyone would like to know. But basically, orally, like eating it, is generally one of the safest ways because your body is designed to take things in that way, right? So it runs it through your stomach acid and your liver and your kidneys and all the stuff. And as a result, it hits you much more slowly, and generally you get less of the drug in your brain. So a lot of people that use drugs bypass those by snorting it or smoking it or injecting it or putting it up their butt or whatever they want to, whatever their strategy is going to be. And the problem with that is just there's a greater chance of overdose because the systems your body have in place to titrate a fatal overdose have been bypassed. You bypassed your liver and your kidneys. Okay. Opiate overdose basics.
So what is Narcan? Narcan here is the nasal applicator that contains the drug naloxone, which is a powerful opioid antagonist, which allows us to reverse opioid overdoses if they happen. This can be used by anyone with basic training, which is what you're going to receive in this video. So when should you use Narcan? You should use Narcan in any situation where you suspect that someone has taken drugs and they're currently experiencing a loss of consciousness. Now, the nice thing about naloxone and Narcan is that if you give it to someone who's not experiencing an opioid overdose, it won't cause them any harm. And since we're seeing highly potent opioids showing up in all kinds of other drugs like Xanax and cocaine and MDMA, it's wise, even if they haven't taken an opioid, to assume if they're experiencing a loss of consciousness that it's an opioid overdose. So just in general with Narcan, it's better safe than sorry. The only situations in which you shouldn't be thinking about administering Narcan is if the person is still conscious. Even if they're starting to fade out, if they're responding to you, then Narcan isn't necessary at that point. How to assess if a person's experiencing an opioid overdose. So the first thing to look for would be if the person's responsive to outside stimulus. So if you're shaking them, saying their name loudly, you can rub on their sternum, take your 4 knuckles and rub on their sternum pretty firmly. You can also do the same thing with their lip. Those are essentially just really aversive things that if the person is asleep or semi-conscious, they're going to come to a certain degree and respond to you. The next thing to look for is their breathing. So if their breathing is labored or not happening, and by labored, it could just sound like a wheeze, it could sound like a gurgling or a choking sound. Any of those things, then that's another sign the person might be experiencing an opioid overdose. The last thing to look for is discoloration. So if the person has pale skin, you'll see their lips turning blue. Their skin will start to get pale and clammy. If the person has darker skin, their skin might be more ashen colored. You still see like clamminess involved. So those are the 3 things to look for: responsiveness to outside stimulus, how is their breathing, and are they showing some discoloration. So we're going to demonstrate what to do if you come across someone that's non-responsive and you suspect that it's an opioid overdose. So you'll have the person, you'll approach here. The first thing we're going to try to do is identify if the person is responding to outside stimulus. So I'll shake his shoulder, say his name, Tim, Tim, Tim. Not getting anything. The next thing I would move to is a sternum rub. So again, I'm taking these 4 fingers, putting it on his sternum. You press down pretty hard and you rub. You could do the same thing with his lip above his, or under his nose as well. And again, that's just the aversive stimulus. So let's say that Tim hasn't woken up from any of these things and he hasn't responded to me. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put my ear next to his mouth, and I'm going to put these 2 fingers on his carotid artery, and that's to try to see if he's breathing and if he has a pulse. So I'll go down here. I'm going to be looking at Tim's chest to see if it's rising and lowering. And I can also hear if he's breathing. And then this way, with my 2 fingers, I can get a sense if he has a pulse. So from this, let's assume that he has a pulse, but he's not breathing. That's something that you might be likely to see in the case of an opioid overdose. The opioid is generally suppressing the respiratory system, so they will go into cardiac arrest after not having oxygen for long enough, but at least initially they'll have a pulse. So we're just assuming that he's not breathing, but he has a pulse. So the next thing I do, if I suspect it's an opioid overdose, or I have no information to counter that, is I'm gonna give him Narcan, right? So I take it out of the package. There's a fairly simple applicator. You're just gonna stick it up his nose, push it in, right? And then we're gonna wait about 2 minutes until the next one, right? While I'm waiting, I'm immediately going, I don't know where my phone is, but I'm gonna call 911. I'm gonna call 911, or if someone else is around, I'm gonna instruct them directly and specifically to call 911. At that point, hopefully if you tell them that the person's not responsive and not breathing, they'll ask you to put them on speakerphone, and they'll guide you through what I'm about to tell you for the rest of this. 911 should guide you from that point forward. So what 911 is gonna tell me is to start providing rescue breathing. Since he has a pulse, we don't have to provide chest compressions. If he didn't have a pulse, we'd want to provide chest compressions. But in this case, he's just not breathing. So we're just trying to get oxygen into his system. His heart will pump it throughout his body as long as he has a pulse. So For rescue breathing, what we're going to do is we're going to tilt his head backwards so that his windpipe is straight, and then we're going to open, provide a connection, and go 2 breaths. In, wait a second, in. Now you should be noticing if it's working effectively, his chest will rise as I push in. If it's not, I might need to get a better seal around his mouth, or it's possible that his head isn't far enough back, so we're not getting a clear move down his windpipe. If you aren't getting a pulse and they're instructing you to do chest compressions, they'll take you through this to a certain degree, but just to show you, you have his sternum here. You want to put down your arm so that the pressure is going onto the left side of his chest, but that my fingers in the compression space is just above his sternum. I'll be with my arms locked, going down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then taking a breath from that. By this point, it's been about 2 minutes, I'll re-administer the Narcan. If nothing's happening, I'll keep giving the rescue breathing and doing the chest compressions again, only if he doesn't have a pulse, until EMS arrives. And that's the main thing. Let's say that we get super lucky and he does start responding. Let's say from the rescue breathing or the Narcan or anything like that. In that sort of situation, what you're gonna do is you're gonna roll him over. You're gonna put this arm out to stop him from rolling forward. You're gonna take this arm and put it under his face. You're gonna take this top leg and put it out forward. The reason for this position is that he can't roll forward onto his face and his airway is clear. So if he starts to vomit, it'll come out and we can keep that breathing going. If at no point he starts breathing on his own before EMS arrives, I'm gonna keep giving those rescue breaths consistently until they do arrive. Important considerations. Should I really call 911? The short answer is yes, you should call 911. If the person really is not responsive and not breathing, the Narcan might be helpful, but it might not work. The person might need more Narcan, or they might be overdosing on something that isn't an opioid. In general, the safest move for that person's health, if they're non-responsive and not breathing, is to call 911 and get EMS services there as quickly as you can. Now, luckily, there is a law in the state of Colorado called the Good Samaritan Law, which specifically states that anyone who calls 911 in response to an overdose is immune from prosecution, and the person who is overdosing, and anyone who is on the premises or around at the time, as long as someone calls 911. So according to that law, you should be a little bit safer, legally speaking, if you call 911 as well. However, it's important to acknowledge that when you bring in EMS, there is always a possibility of there being a police contact. Generally, at least in Colorado, when EMS shows up, police don't show up, but it is always a possibility that the police show up. And I'm aware that for many people, police contact is never safe. It is still always going to be the case that it would be safer if that person had EMS present. But if the person is responding to Narcan and you have enough Narcan that you can keep giving it to them if they start to overdose again, then you could theoretically not call 911. But again, the safest move is still going to be to call 911. All right, so many of you might wonder whether or not Narcan expires. Narcan in the box and in the individual packaging like this will have an expiration date on it. However, your Narcan will be effective for many years after the expiration date. I've been told up to 30 years afterwards. Since we're experiencing a Narcan shortage, it's important not to throw away your Narcan when it's just a year past the expiration date. It still might be very much effective. If you're not willing to use it, then you can give it to someone else who might be more willing to use an expired Narcan. The naloxone should still be effective many, many years after the expiration date is done. In terms of storage, you're going to want to keep your Narcan at room temperature. That's between 66 degrees Fahrenheit and 76 degrees Fahrenheit. The dangerous temperatures to go outside of are below 40 degrees Fahrenheit and above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that keeping your Narcan in the freezer or in your hot car both could accelerate the expiration of your Narcan. So just keep that in mind if that's where you're going to keep those things. Ideally, it just needs to be kept in like a cool, dry place, room temperature, no problem.
Okay, does anyone have any questions?
How would you approach someone who is close to you versus somebody who's like a member of your community? If they are serious, like if their addiction has become serious to when it's life threatening, but you don't want to tell them to get off the drugs because you know that they're not going to get off the drugs.
So what I would do in those situations, generally, yeah, if you end up in the situation where you're trying to get them to stop using, even if you're like not explicitly saying I want you to stop using or you need to stop using, but there's like that's that attitude to it. A lot of times people seriously caught in severe addiction are already in these like shame spirals where like they feel like they shouldn't be doing it and they already have all the shame around it. And oftentimes that shame is a trigger for using anyway. And so you can end up in these really toxic spirals with people where you're trying to help them, but you're getting increasingly frustrated and like personally involved in their sobriety, and they're failing to like meet up to that. And you're being frustrated and irritated with them isn't doing anything to make them use less. And so this is just to say, I don't generally tell people to stop doing drugs. I just don't think it works. I don't think it helps. And so instead, I have a kind of my way of approaching it is that the top goal is not abstinence. The top goal is survival, because you have to live in order to recover. The next goal would be stability, right? So like keeping the things in their life going, keeping a job, like being able to keep housing, et cetera, et cetera. And then somewhere way down that list would be abstinence. If we can accomplish stability without abstinence, then it's higher up on the priority list, right? I think often in the addiction recovery community, there's a kind of discursive move, like a move in terms of definitions and concepts that's been made, where the idea is the only way to survival and abstinence, or survival and stability is abstinence, right? And I am here to tell you all that I believe that as a result of prohibition, making drug use so significantly ostracized and dangerous, right, that being stable and living while being an active addict has become untenable. So that is something that our society has done, not the drugs themselves, right? So with that in mind, someone close to me or in the community, the first step is to try to get them a safer supply, like to try to improve their supply with testing, right? So encourage them to get testing done. And then also talk about Narcan and fentanyl testing strips and never using alone. And I think especially for opioid users, pharmaceutical like painkillers, the main thing they're going to be running into is either they're real pharmaceuticals that they're taking too much of, or much more likely they're buying them off the street and they've been pressed in Mexico and they're not actually what they say they are. And so the overdose rate for those would be much higher. Sometimes they're okay with that. They got a deal on the pills. They should be $10 for oxys. They got a $5 oxy because it's not really oxys and they're cool with that. And in those situations, what you want to do is make sure that someone around them knows they're using and knows how to use Narcan. And that's the best you can do. And people won't always help themselves, but you got to hope that if they recognize how dangerous the situation is, that they'll make some efforts, right? So you could get them to use the don't use alone, never use alone hotline if they don't have a friend to like watch them, or if you're the person in their life, if you're their loved one, right? And like you are willing to take a certain like role in this to keep them safe, maybe you're one of the people they tell they're using, right? And then you can check in on them and see how they're doing. And that way you're the first person to know if they've had an overdose, and you can potentially get them Narcan or an ambulance. And so to try to keep that line of communication open, I think is really, really important. And to shut people down by saying that you need to stop doing drugs is alienating and generally shaming, and doesn't do that. And it could close that line of communication completely, where you don't know what they're doing or what they're up to. And that's when they're going to die. And so if the goal is to keep people alive, I think we need to just talk about it. And yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, so like the hotlines and like the text line for to not use alone, that kind of thing. How can someone do that and not have their data recorded? And like how, because I could see how folks may feel really uncomfortable using something like that, thinking that, oh, well, now they, like, I don't know, the police could tap that and now they'll find out that I was using this. And
So I don't know anything about the confidentiality systems for Fireside or the Never Use Alone hotline. I would hope that they're doing, especially Fireside is doing something to like encrypt their data, but people are not great with that stuff. What I would say is that for Never Use Alone, especially if you stop being responsive, right? Like if they think you're gone, they're going to send EMS to your house, right? And so that is like a police contact. Like often they send police with EMS people. And again, that would count, right? Like the Good Samaritan law should be in effect and should be protective of you, but that is a reason that people will avoid using and avoid using those services. And I don't have like a solid, like that will never happen to you sort of thing. I can tell you that a lot of people die from using alone. And so there's some sort of middle ground, hopefully, to be made. I mean, part of the problem is like, there are a handful of humans and organizations out here trying to like help drug users. And then the rest of the system is trying to ostracize, criminalize, and oppress them. And so that makes it very difficult to like get any sort of like collaborative support from institutions. Because yeah, obviously, like the cops have been trained on 50 years of drug war. Like they aren't safe. And so unfortunately, that's the only access to our medical services is tied up with like a highly militarized, highly oppressive carceral system. I wish I could change that.
Thank you. I was wondering, at some point in your presentation, you talked about different categories of drugs and which ones were like physically, like contributed to a physical overdose, and which ones more were psychological overdose. I don't know if you remember that part. It was in the. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could very quickly.
totally.
I want to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the way to think about it is that so different classes of drugs interact with your body and brain in different ways, right? And some of them are playing with systems that aren't in charge of anything that keeps you alive, right? So your serotonin system, for instance, is in charge of like vision and mood and appetite and all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't keep your heart and lungs running, right? And so you can highly fuck with that system, right, with the psychedelic and not cause a physical overdose, right? You could end up with lasting psychological damage or something like that, right? Or if you mix it with an MAOI or an SSRI, you can have a serotonin syndrome, and that can be fatal. But generally, so that class of things that mess with serotonin are generally the psychological adversity category. Then there's what I call like the depressants. So things that lower your general activity. So like alcohol, benzos, GHB, ketamine, they're downers, right? Opiates would be in this category. All of those carry a greater risk of physical overdose because the systems that they're depressing are systems that you use to run things that are important. So like you use your central nervous system and GABA to keep your heart going and keep your lungs going. You use opiates for a similar sort of thing. Like both of those neurotransmitters are involved in those systems. And so if they get too altered, right, you can lose the ability for your brain to tell your heart and your lungs to continue working, right? And then that's like the physical overdose. So with opiates, generally it's respiratory depression. They depress your breathing. With benzos and alcohol, which work on your central nervous system, oftentimes it's in the form of seizures or like strokes and things like that. Like people will have these like very intense experiences. Well, I guess seizures is on the other side if you're withdrawing. Sorry. So if you take too much benzos or too much alcohol, it's a sedative in that same way. But I think it's your heart and your lungs that will go out first in that system with those two. Might be wrong about that one. But and then with stimulants, so like amphetamines, MDMA would be in this category. Methamphetamine would be in this category. Adderall would be in this category. Over time and with high enough levels of use, they're cardiotoxic, meaning that they're slowly eroding your heart muscle if you're using them for long periods of time and at high doses. And so that's where you see like people that have been cocaine users for 10 years they'll be like 35, but they'll have a heart attack or, stuff like that. The other thing I should mention is that a common mix that happens, obviously mixing is a whole other category. And as I mentioned in the presentation, like everything just gets more risky, like once you start to combine them, but very few users are single drug users. And so it's important to talk about it in that way. Like most people are polysubstance users that are users. So one of the other mixes that can be kind of dangerous besides benzos and alcohol is uppers and downers. So like a stimulant with an opiate, for instance, like speedballing. That's also much, much harder on your heart and can cause like cardiac events like while you're on it. And the reason that's happening is because both of those drugs are telling your system to do opposite things, and it can cause fibrillation. And so, yeah, so it really just depends. And those are very general things. There's a lot of like sub things to be said. And if anyone wants any like consult, I'm happy to do it. That's a lot of what I end up doing at Dance Safe, is just like telling people about their drugs and how they might want to take them differently.
I heard recently someone talking about how the fentanyl epidemic is actually being overblown. Have you heard anything about that? And what does that mean?
I mean, it's hard to react to. It's not like, there's not a lot there. Here's what I can say about like what makes the conversation about fentanyl more complicated, right? The narrative that like drugs are deadly just because fentanyl exists in the supply is like not accurate. It is true that a lot of the overdoses that we're seeing are being driven by really potent contaminants like fentanyl. One of the things is so for instance, like with heroin proper, like diacetylmorphine, we weren't really seeing overdoses where it was just the heroin. For instance, you'd see like heroin and alcohol or heroin and benzos, which is still what we see to some degree, but we do also now see just overdoses of the fentanyl itself. So it seems like fentanyl, even adjusted for its potency, has a higher overdose profile than other opiates.
I think the context was that there are deaths due to fentanyl, but it's so small compared to what we're being told. Like it's 500 deaths a year or something like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Hundreds of thousands that we're hearing.
I love myself a good conspiracy theory, and I think that's totally bullshit. Yeah, I mean, even just like the actual loss of life that I've seen around me is like not reflective of 500 deaths a year. And so, yeah, I don't buy it. But someone might have other data on that I'm not familiar with. I've gotten pretty deep in that particular data, but I'm just using government data, right? So like if there's a conspiracy to like oversell it, I'm a part of that, right? Because I'm reading CDC data and NIDA data to go about it. One thing I will mention, and this is something very complicated in the data, and I talk about it when I talk about it, the overdose crisis in that other video. So let's say someone like it's a drug overdose of some kind, they weren't breathing, their heart stopped, DOA, whatever, something along those lines. We do a tox screen on them. They turn out positive for methamphetamine and fentanyl, right? Now, does that mean that person took methamphetamine that was tainted with fentanyl and is a fentanyl contamination overdose, right? Or is that person a fentanyl and methamphetamine user and overdose on fentanyl because they didn't know the dosage, right? Which is still because it's illegal and all that kind of stuff, right? But like that we don't know, right? And like a lot of times the best we have for that is like people in that person's life like telling us this is the case or this wasn't the case, right? Like, and they often won't know. Like if that person is using opioids, they're not telling their using buddies that only use cocaine, right? Because those people would be like, oh, that's the wrong kind of drugs. And so that is like a difficult piece of the data, right? And we really don't know the answer to that. And that's one of the reasons why trying to figure out like what percentage of like, for instance, what percentage of MDMA has fentanyl in it? And like, even let's say like Denver, let's get specific. It's really hard to answer that question based on overdose statistics, right? Because again, we don't really know if that's like a combination thing or if it's two separate incidences, because most substance using populations are polysubstance users. And so it could even be the case that like the person didn't ever take fentanyl, but took methamphetamine and used Xanax to land from their benders. And the Xanax was actually a fake Xanax from Mexico that was just fentanyl. Like there's so many possible, and so just getting the tox screen is really vague. And I could see, and similar kind of with the COVID death thing, right? Like, someone is somewhere that's like an official bureaucrat has to like record it as like a fentanyl overdose or, and that gets really gray.
Hey, Brendan, I had a question earlier when you were doing the residue testing for fentanyl. Is there value to like applying a lot of pressure to the bag? I mean, I know like for crystal or ketamine or stuff, I would do that anyway, just to use it to crush things up. So is there value in really working it over before transferring it, or does it not matter either way? Or
so I have not been instructed in that specifically, but I always crush everything up, and that's actually something I've thought about adding to that video. It's one of the many ways. It's just a little bit incomplete. If the idea is that this fentanyl could be anywhere in the sample, you're going to want it to be as uniformly crushed up and exposed to the static on the sides of the bag as you possibly can. This is actually worth mentioning. I know that it's like a huge drag to have to dissolve everything in water, but that like static on the sides of the bag thing, like even Mitchell Gomez, like who's the executive director of DanceSafe and makes the instructions, like he'll tell you, like, we have no idea, like if you're really getting a random sample from like the static on the side of a bag, like, or what the odds are. Like, let's say there's like 1 milligram of fentanyl in your gram of powder, right? Like, what is the odds that you catch it on the side of the bag if you do everything right? And no one can tell you that number. Like, we don't even know how much of a risk you're taking by not testing everything. What we know is if you test everything, the strips are incredibly good at identifying even really small amounts. And so I've increasingly gone towards everything's aqueous now, like, because you have to have tested it first in order to safely use. Yeah, but I mean, the bag is definitely the next best thing. And I still do that for people all the time, right? Like, it's definitely better than nothing. I'm also confident saying that it's definitely better than nothing. And so if you're like, I'm going to roll the dice versus like dissolving it all, definitely test the bag. Hell, even testing 10 milligrams of a random sample of it is better than nothing, right? Yeah, so it's tough. I really wish it was different than that.
is there any way to recrystallize the substance after you've dissolved it in water?
Absolutely. Okay, so what you want to do is those Pyrex dishes, right? Those glass Pyrex dishes that are, so you'll use dissolve or distilled water to dissolve your sample, first of all, because you don't want random like minerals and salts in your result. And then distribute it out to be pretty thin along that like glass Pyrex dish. So if you have a lot to dry out, you'll have to do it in like batches, right? Or do multiple Pyrex dishes, but you only want maybe like a ½ inch, maybe or so of liquid. And then you put your broiler on the low setting. And then once it runs all the way out, after it's like, not when it's actually running, but when it's like finished its little cycle and you like, or you even just turn it off, then with that remaining ambient heat, you put your sample in and it should slowly evaporate out the rest of it. Depending on the substance, different ones are more or less reactive to heat in terms of denaturing the chemical. In the case of something like ketamine, for instance, you're like in luck because it actually would take like 500 plus degrees to denature the ketamine. With something like DMT, you're like much more like risk. Although DMT is a bad example because generally that's like a homemade or someone you actually know. It's kind of like mushrooms, like you generally know the grower. But so different things have different sensitivities and that just gets really complicated. But that general method of basically just like heating it in dry heat, but like very low heat, and air on the side of low, because if you go too high, it could like boil the water, in which case like bubbles will like shoot a bunch of your sample into the bottom of your stove or your oven, or You could denature it, or you could burn it. Like it could all the way dry out, and then you're still heating it, and then it will actually like brown and like burn. But yeah, that's like that's also very complicated. But if that's really how you want to go about it, that's definitely an option.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could speak from wearing the hat of our local harm reductionist as to what you're seeing when people bring stuff in for testing. I mean, I'm particularly interested in ketamine and whether that's like a big issue here in Colorado right now, but anything you could say overall would be really great to hear.
Okay, so ketamine, ketamine's kind of like having its moment. So like, especially white powders, as they get more popular, they get more adulterated, right? Because people are looking to sell other things as them, or they're looking to get more out of their ketamine or whatever, right? And so I'd say in the last like 5 years, we've seen ketamine become a lot more popular, but also a lot more contaminated. In terms of danger, I haven't heard of any fentanyl in ketamine in Colorado, which doesn't mean it's not existing. It just means I haven't heard of it. And I have heard there's sometimes see people getting xylazine instead as like a cut, and then it's mixed with like random shit. I've seen plenty of stuff where it's like 70% ketamine and 30% like various nutritional supplements and just like bulk, like just like the kind of stuff that's like probably not going to harm you if you snort it, but it's not ketamine. And then I'd say the biggest thing is that the big thing right now is that there's this ketamine precursor that you can order off the dark web and basically make your ketamine in the microwave. Like all it needs is heat in an aqueous solution to turn into ketamine. And so a lot of ketamine is like, it'll be like 70% that, and then the rest of it's just this precursor because they're not chemists and they didn't complete the reaction sufficiently, or, and I don't know if taking ketamine precursor A is dangerous or not. But it's in a lot of ketamine right now, so I don't know. Yeah, and we're at time, and I could talk about that topic for the rest of the thing. Okay, and that's it. Thank you all. This is the little thing again, so you can scan it and contact me. I have so much more info, but I feel like I've covered a lot of what needs to be covered. And these are also some like resources that I mentioned earlier in the presentation.